The government this week reported a labor market statistic that is not what everyone thinks it is. In fact, what it really says is that maybe employers have too many employees, which is exactly the thing that employees have been telling consumer surveyors they are most concerned about. So when Jay Powell, an economist, and everyone else says that there's no hard data backing up the crash in consumer confidence, he needs to look at this measure, which is an amalgamation between GDP from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the establishment survey, I kid you not, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This data it backs up all the private consumer surveys, and it's exactly what consumers are hearing and seeing and then telling their surveyors what they know their bosses are talking about, and it's captured all right here in a single series that puts these statistics together. And so the implications here are enormous because this never comes up, and it never comes up from economists or ever anywhere else in the mainstream, since most economists and central bankers look at these numbers and look at them as something that they're absolutely not. What does productivity numbers, that's what we're talking about here, is labor market productivity says, in very blunt terms, is that over the last couple of quarters, and especially the first quarter as productivity turned negative, is that employers have too many workers for the amount of work they have available for them to do, which is, as I just said, exactly what consumers as workers continue to say they're most afraid of. So here we have hard data evidence that the labor market is out of balance, not inflationary, but out of balance with too many workers, too many hours being worked, not enough output going out into the general economy, because underlying all of this, it's the economic situation, it's demand. So Steve, Mr. Van Meter, you were chomping at the bit to talk about productivity. As soon as the statistics came out, I got a text on my phone that said, "Did you see the negative numbers?" I'm like, "Yeah, we got to hit this one on our show because it is incredibly important. And it's one that you never hear anybody talk about it. And when they do talk about it, it's usually the economists speak of, oh, it's lazy Americans or whatever excuse they come up with. But productivity, I know it's a big one for you.
Yeah, Jeff, it's absolutely one of my favorite indicators that nobody else looks at because, again, you might as well just call it the lazy American indicator because that's what the media thinks. Oh, look, they're just less productive. Well, what a shock. The workers elsewhere are so much more efficient and want to work, but not Americans. But, what really shook me about this number is I knew it was the first quarter number and I knew it was preliminary, but when I looked at it, I didn't see the first quarter part. And I was like, what? It went negative. And then I'm like, wait. The first quarter? Are you insane? This makes no sense because we're front running the tariffs. And I thought for sure that maybe it was like a 1 or 2 month thing. And I thought this had made absolutely no sense, Jeff, because I thought productivity would be skyrocketing. I mean, we saw hours work jump, but yet demand over the prior quarter at the end of the year was negative. And that is absolutely staggering because we talk about all the time of why we're headed into a downturn, why things aren't going to turn around. And labor productivity isn't one of those leading indicators because it matches up very well with exactly as you said. What are workers telling us? Hey, we're standing around, not because we're lazy, because we don't have as much work. And the problem is the bosses notice this. And what are they doing? They cut hours. And it makes perfect sense because when you look at what happens with productivity, it comes plunging down. You see hours work drop. And then all of a sudden, something interesting happens. Productivity tends to shoot up. And everyone's like, well, that means the economy is turning around. No, it means layoffs are happening.
Yeah, what it really means is that employers are validated in their view that they have too many workers for the amount of work that they actually have coming in the door. And Steve, yeah, I agree with you. I was shocked because you're right. This is the first quarter. This is before we get to the payback period. This is still with a lot of artificial front running and support in the especially the manufacturing sector in the first quarter. And what that said was, if you read the numbers at face value, and I'm not talking about what economists say, as you said, Steve. If you read those numbers at face value, what they really said was businesses were expecting more of an increase in activity and demand because of all the artificial stuff that happened, not just the tariff front loading, but also remember the people got really excited about rate cuts. The Fed's going to cut rates and the business is going to pick up. And a lot of people got really excited about the election and thought, okay, we're going to have a business friendly administration. Things are really going to start booming. And so what the productivity numbers suggest at face value is that businesses did bring in some more workers, did a little bit more, a little bit more increased hiring and labor market utilization. but they brought in too many. They were expecting it to be better in the short run. And now they have, with demand falling off in the first quarter already and likely to fall off furthermore into the rest of the year, they've got all these workers they didn't need in the fourth quarter and the first quarter, and they're going to have even less work for them to do. This is why consumer confidence has collapsed, because consumers hear this. They know this is going on. And employers are saying the same thing. Boy, we thought the economy was really going to boom there at the end of 2024, and it picked up a little bit, but not nearly enough to justify everything that we've done. So productivity is a very simple single measure, says exactly what we've been hearing. It confirms everything.
Yeah, Jeff. And one of the reasons I was surprised is because, as you know, after the election, what did we see? All of these confidence surveys, particularly from businesses, they just went straight up. And they even held up, even in some cases, into January and February. It wasn't really until March we started to see them coming down. So when I saw the productivity numbers, again, it didn't immediately make sense to me because I'm like, well, wait a minute. The economy was supposed to be booming up until a certain point. And kind of what it tells me is, well, those surveys were all clearly wrong, that they were just hoping that things were going to get better. And then it turned out they didn't get better. But the risk here now is, like you said, there's overemployment. And what we're hearing, at least we're seeing from, say, the unemployment data and some of the surveys, is employers are willing to hang on to people. Now, of course, Jeff, as you and I know, that willingness is only as deep as their pockets are, because at some point their pockets are going to start running empty. So we know the first things that we're going to see happen are already starting. JOLT survey, granted it's lagged, but nevertheless, job openings start to get cut. The next thing that happens, well, you start to cut hours until people complain, say, hey, boss, I don't have enough hours, so I'm going to have to go get a job elsewhere, even though we all know there are no other jobs. That means the boss is going to go back into the office and look at all of his best workers and say, these are the ones I want to keep, and these are the ones that are going to go. And if things get worse, I'm going to start putting people on the unemployment line.
Yeah, that's what we already got the reports from, right? There were scattered reports of layoffs. There was reports that employers are making lists of employees that they're going to let go if they have to. There's a whole lot of that stuff happening. And here we have hard data evidence that shows exactly that. And you're right, Steve. It's employers don't want to get rid of their workers. So if it's just a quarter, they're probably going to overlook the weakness and say probably just temporary. We'll take the short run hit and continue to move on here. But that's what's so potentially alarming about the tariff shock, is that this is okay. The first quarter was supposed to be a lot better than it was. That's already a misstep. But everybody knows that moving on from here, and it's not just the goods economy, but also in the services economy. We've seen a lot of service sector forward-looking indicators just absolutely crash. So businesses that already stumbled in the first quarter expecting things to be better are looking ahead and thinking, how are things going to change moving forward with all these conditions that we have now? It'd have to be sheer luck for that to happen. So the idea that businesses are going to continue to hoard workers for a lot longer, that rope is getting really, really, really narrow. It's getting really, really short. And so that's what consumers as workers are really saying, is we can see this coming. We can hear everybody talking about it. And productivity tells us exactly why that is. They have too many workers. They're working them too much and not getting enough out of them, not because their workers are lazy, but because the economy is poor before we get to the real payback and tariffs.
Yeah, Jeff, and that's why the employee cost number also went up, which would make perfect sense because, of course, businesses are spending more to get less output. But I'm glad you brought up the tariff issue, because this is the reality that we're all facing, is businesses do want to hoard employees. And a lot of people may think that's surprising, but it's not, because what happened during the pandemic is they laid off a lot of their key employees who actually just decided to retire. And then they realized, whoops, we don't have them. And businesses don't want to go through that again. But there's this problem, is there's this belief, at least at the business level, and I think at the consumer level to a degree, is that if the tariffs just come down, everything's going to go back to normal. But the issue, as you and I have discussed about this payback period, is we still have to get to the payback period for the pandemic, and there's going to be a payback period for front running the tariffs. There's going to be a hole. Now, how big the hole in the economy is going to be, how long, now we don't know. But we know it's coming. But there's this whole idea is that it doesn't actually exist, that yes, as soon as the walls come down and the barriers go to zero, that everyone's going to come out and spend. But Jeff, you've talked in the past about inventory recessions and how inventory levels are high, and they're up there. And yet, we hear from companies like Nike, it said, well, we cut our prices and, well, it didn't really work. And so you see that, you're from some employers are claiming like, yeah, well, we have 6 to 8 weeks of inventory. Yes, of the things that people really want to buy. But you have a lot of inventory of old stuff that people don't want anymore. You've got to discount it. And then you still got to get the lags of supply chain. You got to get those orders back on the books. You've got to get things produced. You got to get them on ships. You got to get them here to warehouses, into the stores. It's going to take time. There's going to be some pain coming. And I agree with you. The amount of rope that these employers are willing to hang on to keep people, I don't think it's quite as long as everyone thinks it's going to be.
To begin with, you mentioned the payback from the pandemic. It was productivity that warned that that was taking place. You go back to 2022, the first quarter of 2022, the technical recession that the BEA has erased in its revisions, but there was a weak spot in 2022, the beginning of that year. What productivity did in the initial estimates that came out was a record drop in productivity. And what that said was that essentially companies were bringing back more workers than they actually needed, because these are volume statistics. This is not price illusion. This is not about prices. So prices were rising. Everybody thought it was a red hot economy, but employers were saying, okay, we're getting more in revenue, but we don't have as much to do. The actual volumes are nowhere near recovering. It's just simply prices. That's why I call it the price illusion. And productivity showed that they brought in more workers than they actually, when everybody's talking about labor shortage and everything that Steve just mentioned, what employers were saying is, what are you talking about labor shortage? Yeah, we can't find skilled workers that we want. We want to pay them more, but we don't want to. But we can't find, I mean, we have more workers than we need for the amount of work that's actually recovering from the pandemic. And so what productivity numbers said in 2022 was that businesses were likely to realize that they didn't need any more employees. And whether they wanted to fire them or not doesn't matter. They stopped hiring. And so what you see is that productivity plunged in the first half of 2022, and immediately thereafter, the BLS's hours index, which comes from the establishment survey, flatlined. What it said was employers realized they don't have enough business coming in the door to justify hiring any more workers or working them anymore. So the forgot how to grow economy that I've been talking about was right there in the productivity figures from the very beginning. It said exactly what it seems to say, not what economists say. There was not enough work, not enough recovery back in 2022. And that's where all of the payback really began.
Yeah, and now we're seeing it happen again. And so you think about inflation coming. Of course, we know the tariffs are likely to cause prices to go up. But what does this mean for the real rank and file worker? Well, if productivity is going down and you're standing around, it means your hours are going to get cut, your paycheck is going to shrink. And against higher prices, your dollar is not going to go as far, which means you're going to have to cut your spending. So at the same time, we're seeing the economy slow down and being validated by the productivity data. What it's telling us is there's going to be other employees in other industries that have been actually doing fine that are now going to find the same issue, that demand is falling. They're going to be less productive. Their hours are going to get cut. Their paychecks are going to shrink. And next thing you know, you start to notice one really interesting piece of data when you look at productivity is, again, when it spikes, it's because layoffs start to go. Jeff, as you said, the question is, how long is the runway? Are employers really willing to stick around for a quarter to see if things change? I don't know. We'll find out. But my guess is they don't have quite as much money as everyone's hoping they do.
Your guess is exactly what consumers are saying. In fact, we got more data along those same lines from the Fed itself, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's survey of consumer expectations. And what they found in the latest survey for April was exactly what Steve said, that consumers are worried the runway, which they thought was this long, is actually maybe this long. And so the job loss expectations soared. The expectation that unemployment is going to be higher a year from now was absolutely huge. In fact, it's only been higher on 3 other occasions, and 2 of those were the middle of 2020. Job finding expectations absolutely plunged under 50%. They're now almost as low as they were during the lockdowns and the pandemics. In fact, they're so low, they're like the early 2010s, back when nobody was hiring, and the productivity numbers showed we were in for a very long decade in the labor market. And that proved to be correct. So consumers are saying income expectations. That was another one. Income expectations from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, they dropped to a cycle low, which shows that, especially at the bottom end of the range, a lot of consumers are afraid that not only there are no jobs out there, the firings are actually closer at hand than not. And so you're getting these indications from these consumer surveys where it's not just, oh, we're pessimistic about tariffs. We're pessimistic that tariffs are going to drive employers to relook at their businesses and say, we don't have enough work for the workers that we have to begin with, and it doesn't look like it's getting any better further down the road. So the runway is that small and narrow. Therefore, what they're saying is they can tell the turn is very likely coming, and not, sometime next year. If this really does continue over the next several months, then that's what they're saying. They're saying that productivity confirms that there's too many workers for the amount of work that's out there.
So what's interesting, Jeff, is when workers start to see that, hey, my paycheck is going to shrink, or maybe even the outlook for my job or the labor market is getting worse, the natural effect of that is they start saving money. So you start to notice the personal savings rate go up, and you see demand going down, spending decline, retail sales fall, because they realize, look, if things don't turn around, I'm going to be on the unemployment line. I've got a whole bunch of bills and I have no money. So I better start saving some up, because I'm already talking to my friends who've lost their job and there's nothing out there. So I could be stuck on unemployment for a long time. So when things start to turn around or turn down, what happens is it gets accelerated because of the behavior of people and their desire to save money instead of course, go out and consume. As they consume less, inventory levels don't get worked down, demand doesn't go. So as you mentioned earlier, what this is a sign of is that the backlogs are finally getting worked out. And this is a question that I've had for years now, because it's like the world's longest backlog of when is this coming to an end? Because the bottom line is when backlogs end, and this is exactly what productivity is saying, it's exactly what workers are saying, it means the unemployment line is going to be the near-term employer for a lot of people. And what we're going to find out is they're going to save money, spend less, and it's just going to spiral right into what we expect was already going to happen.
Yeah, you mentioned consumer spending already, and that's one of the things I think Jay Powell mentioned at his press conference this past week. What he basically said was, yeah, we see consumer sentiment surveys that have crashed, and we're not happy about those, but we're going to set those aside because we don't see any evidence that consumer sentiment is becoming more than just a bunch of angry people spouting off their negative emotions. That's absolutely not the case. What Steve just said is absolutely true. We do see in the real economy, not just in productivity. Productivity gives us the background behind all this. We do see already in the first quarter, consumers cut back on spending. You mentioned retail sales, Steve. They were down big time in January. They failed to come back in February. And the quarter was only saved in March by a splurge of people trying to buy goods before prices went up. That's not consumer strength. That's instead a one-time benefit that's not going to be repeated in the second quarter. And consumers are already spending in a way that's consistent with flagging sentiment. And the reason that sentiment is falling is because of what productivity says. There's not enough demand in the economy to justify these workers, which means that workers know and employers know they have to do some cutting here. So the forgot how to grow economy that forgot how to hire years ago starts to become remember how to fire.
Yep. And Jeff, just a matter of time now before we actually start to see that happen. My guess is that employers are going to go a few weeks, because if these trade barriers don't come down, and even if they do, you think about all the imports into the country. We've been talking about how that's collapsing. Well, just because the dock workers have a contract doesn't mean they're going to get infinite hours. You're going to see hours get cut. You're hearing from people in the trucking industry saying, I don't have any loads, but yet I have fixed expenses like insurance costs and other things. Look, if this doesn't turn around and quick, I'm out of business. So I think the reality is a lot of employers are saying they want to hold on to people, but in truth, I don't think they're going to be able to hold on. Of course, they also know they can just go to the unemployment line and get them back if things turn around. But the reality of that is once we hit this air pocket, this payback period could go for a lot longer than people think.
Yeah, that's the other side of that is everybody's really fixated on trade deals. And the reason they're fixated on trade deals is because of what Steve just said. The idea that, okay, if we'll get those trade deals done and then the worst case won't happen, we can just smooth everything over. But then that gives us right back to productivity and the face value reading of it, which says that everything was weak before we got to the trade wars and the tariffs. So trade deals are not going to fix the economy that was already heading in the wrong direction before we got to the first quarter anyway. And so everybody wants to make productivity about what it isn't. What it is confirmation that the economy is in bad shape to begin with. And regardless of trade deals, that's not going to change moving forward.